The Olympic Games are meant to celebrate the very best of humanity: strength, endurance, unity, and the relentless pursuit of excellence. Every 4 years, the world gathers to watch athletes push their bodies to the limit in the name of sport and national pride. But behind the spectacle of gold medals and world records lies a darker, rarely discussed side of Olympic history. From catastrophic accidents to acts of violence, these incidents remind us that even on the world's biggest stage, danger is never far away. These are 5 of the most horrifying deaths ever connected to the Olympic Games.
Athletes returned to the Whistler Sliding Center on Saturday, one day after the death of a luger from Georgia. Canceling the luge competition was a real thought for Olympic organizers.
Just hours before the world gathered for the opening ceremony of the 2010 Winter Olympics, a chilling tragedy unfolded on the icy track at Whistler. 21-year-old Georgian luger Nodar Kumaritashvili had spent years chasing a dream that few in his country had ever touched. By the time he qualified for Vancouver, simply making it to the Olympic stage was a triumph in itself. It was supposed to be the beginning of a long career, not the end of one. That morning, he climbed onto his sled for what was meant to be just another training run. It was his 25th attempt on the course, and he had already completed 15 runs from the men's start. The Whistler Sliding Center had developed a reputation as one of the fastest tracks ever built, with speeds exceeding what designers had originally predicted. Some athletes and officials had already expressed concern about how extreme the course felt, especially in its final curves. Still, training continued, and Nodar prepared for his descent. The air was cold, the ice was fast, and the opening ceremony was only hours away. As he launched from the start, gravity took over, pulling him down the twisting channel of ice at terrifying speed. Corner after corner flashed by in seconds. Then came the final turn. At nearly 144 kilometers per hour, something went terribly wrong. In a split second, he lost control. The sled jolted violently as it exited the curve. Before he could react, the force launched him over the sidewall of the track. There was no time to brace, no time to slow down. He was thrown into the open air, helpless against the speed and momentum, before striking an unpadded steel support pole. The impact was devastating. Medics rushed to his side almost immediately. CPR and mouth-to-mouth resuscitation were performed on the spot as officials and crew members stood frozen in shock. He was airlifted to the Whistler Health Care Center, but the injuries were too severe. The young athlete who had driven across continents to compete, who prayed before every run, and who carried the hopes of his small nation with him, was pronounced dead. It was the first fatal luge accident at the Olympics in decades, and the timing made it even more haunting. The Games had not even officially begun. Within minutes, news of the crash spread across the globe. What should have been a day of celebration suddenly turned into one of mourning. In Georgia, the shock was immediate and overwhelming. Television footage of the crash circulated rapidly, leaving the nation in grief. Back at the Olympic Village, his teammates were devastated. Some openly questioned whether they could continue competing at all. For a moment, the entire Georgian delegation considered withdrawing from the Games. But after discussions with government officials and team leaders, they made a difficult decision. They would stay, and they would compete in his honor. That night, when the opening ceremony began, the Georgian team marched into the stadium wearing black armbands. Their national flag carried a black ribbon tied to it. One space in the line remained empty, a silent and powerful tribute to the teammate who should have been walking beside them. As they entered the arena, the crowd rose to its feet, delivering a long, emotional, standing ovation. The Games went on, but the tragedy forced immediate changes. Officials lowered the start position for men's luge to reduce speeds, modified the track's final turns, and installed protective barriers where Nodar had struck the pole.
At the 1964 Winter Olympics in Innsbruck, tragedy struck when 19-year-old Australian skier Ross Milne, despite his experience, encountered a fatal accident.
In the freezing mountains above Innsbruck, the slopes of Pacherkofel were supposed to host the world's best skiers during the 1964 Winter Olympics. But in the days leading up to the races, there was a quiet unease hanging over the course. The winter had brought unusually little snow, forcing workers and even soldiers to haul in tons of it from other areas just to build the track. Among the athletes preparing for the downhill was 19-year-old Australian skier Ross Milne. He came from the small town of Myrtleford, far from the famous ski resorts of Europe. Ross wasn't there just to make up the numbers. Back home, he was considered the country's best downhill skier, a natural athlete who could turn his hand to almost anything: water skiing, horse riding, tennis. Friends described him as cheerful, steady, and fearless without being reckless. He had already spent time racing in Europe and was determined to prove that Australians could compete with the best in the world. For him, the Olympics weren't just a personal dream. They were a chance to put his country on the winter sports map. On the morning of January 25, 1964, he lined up for an official training run. The course was crowded, with nearly 100 racers allowed onto it at once. There was little control, little spacing, and almost no room for error on a slope lined with trees and rocks. Ross pushed off just before 11:30 a.m., gliding down the icy track at increasing speed. The first section passed quickly, the wind roaring in his ears. Then he approached one of the steepest parts of the course, where visibility was limited until the last moment. As he came over the rise, he suddenly saw a group of skiers gathered ahead, blocking his path. At around 60 to 70 kilometers per hour, there was no time to think. Instinct took over. He tried to slow down and swerve around them, but the surface wasn't designed for sudden braking or sharp turns. His skis caught an edge. In an instant, he lost control. He shot off the course and slammed directly into a tree. Teammates further down the slope didn't even realize what had happened at first, but when one of them walked back up the course and saw Ross lying there, the reality hit with brutal force. He was unconscious, gravely injured. Medics rushed to him, attempting mouth-to-mouth resuscitation as he was carried off the mountain. A helicopter flew him to the hospital, but the damage was too severe. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The news spread quickly through the Olympic Village. Just days earlier, another athlete had already died in training, and now the Games were facing a second fatality before the competitions had even begun in earnest. For the small Australian team, the loss was devastating. Teammates and officials reportedly wept openly during an emotional memorial service that same afternoon, unable to process how the bright, confident young skier was suddenly gone. Back in Australia, his younger brother Malcolm had just arrived in Melbourne with their parents, preparing to fly to Europe to watch Ross compete. Instead, a knock on the hotel room door delivered the terrible news. The trip was canceled. The family turned around and drove back home in silence. In the aftermath, the official inquiry claimed Ross had simply caught an edge and lost control. Some officials even suggested that racers from countries like Australia were too inexperienced to compete on such dangerous courses, but his teammates and managers strongly disagreed. They pointed to the overcrowded training run, the lack of course control, and the trees lining the track with minimal protection. Many believed the accident could have been prevented.
A Swiss skier died during a practice run for the Olympics today, and there's some dispute over the circumstances of the accident. Speed skier Nicolas Bochete was on a public slope getting ready for the finals.
On February 22, 1992, at Les Arcs during the 1992 Winter Olympics, 27-year-old Swiss speed skier Nicolas Bochete stood on the edge of what could have been the defining moment of his career. He wasn't just another competitor on the mountain. Nicolai was the reigning Swiss speed skiing champion, a man who had clocked terrifying speeds of over 210 kilometers per hour, making him one of the fastest humans ever to stand on skis. The Olympic spirit also ran deep in his family. His aunt, Fernande Bochete, had won a bronze medal in giant slalom back in 1968. For Nicolas, these games were about more than adrenaline or personal glory. They were about family, pride, and continuing a legacy. That morning, the mountain carried the quiet tension that always comes before competition. Speed skiing, then only a demonstration sport, was scheduled for its finals later that day. Before the official runs, Nicolas joined his teammate Pierre-Yves Jourang and several American competitors for a warm-up session. It wasn't part of the formal event, just athletes stretching their legs, testing the snow, and feeding that familiar rush of speed. They had skied the slope before, a section that rolled over a blind hill where the terrain dipped sharply. For men used to flying at over 120 or even 130 miles per hour, it felt routine. But routine can hide danger in the smallest details. As Nicholas approached the rise, he accelerated, then lifted off the snow as he crested the hill. For a brief moment, he was airborne. In that split second, he had no way of knowing what waited on the other side. Just beyond the ridge sat a snowcat, an enormous grooming machine used to maintain the slopes. Whether it was moving or standing still, whether its lights were flashing or its siren sounding, would later become the center of heated debate. But in that instant, none of it mattered. As Nicholas landed, traveling at nearly 100 miles per hour, he came face to face with the massive machine. There was no time to react, no space to turn, no chance to slow down. The collision was immediate, violent, and fatal. Nicholas Beauchete was killed on the spot. Shock rippled through the games within minutes. Teammates who had been skiing the same slope moments earlier were left stunned, realizing how easily the tragedy could have been theirs. Olympic officials quickly issued statements, insisting the snowcat had been visible, with lights flashing and sirens sounding. But members of the Swiss team painted a very different picture. They claimed the machine had been parked silently behind the hill, hidden from view until it was too late. Some even noted that Nicholas had been using slalom skis instead of his specialized speed skis, which might have affected his control. Yet these details offered little comfort. One blind crest, one unseen obstacle, and a life was gone. There was a cruel irony to it all. Speed skiing was already considered one of the most dangerous winter sports, a spectacle where athletes pointed themselves straight downhill, accelerating faster than most cars on the highway. The sport itself was a calculated risk, a dance with gravity and danger. But it wasn't the speed or the slope that killed Nicholas. It wasn't a fall or a crash caused by the terrain. It was a snow groomer, a machine meant to make the mountain safer, that ended his life. At just 27 years old, Nicholas became the third athlete to die at a Winter Olympics. For his wife and children, the heartbreak was unimaginable. One moment, they had a husband and father chasing his Olympic dream. The next, they were left with an emptiness that could never be filled. In January 1964, the mountains above Innsbruck were alive with Olympic anticipation. For the first time in history, luge was set to make its debut at the 1964 Winter Olympics, and athletes from around the world had gathered to test themselves on the icy track at Eigels. Among them was an unlikely competitor, 58-year-old British luger Kazimierz K. Skrzypecki, a man whose life story sounded more like an adventure novel than an Olympic resume. He wasn't a teenage prodigy or a lifelong winter sports star. He had been born in Eastern Europe, trained as an architect, and survived the chaos of World War II as a Royal Air Force officer, serving with Polish squadrons in Britain. By 1964, he had earned a place on the British Olympic team. It was an extraordinary achievement. Luge was a brand new Olympic sport, and the British team itself was still finding its footing. But Kai Skrzypecki carried himself with determination. He was older than nearly every competitor around him, yet he was there on merit, driven by the same Olympic dream as athletes decades younger. On January 21st, just days before the opening ceremony, he stepped onto the Eigels track for a training run. The course was fast, technical, and unforgiving, a twisting ribbon of ice bordered by hard walls and sharp turns. There were no medals at stake that day, no cheering crowds, just the quiet, tense atmosphere of practice runs where athletes pushed themselves to the limit. As he sped down the track, something went wrong. Details of the crash were never fully clear, but at some point during the descent he lost control. His luge sled slammed violently against the side of the chute. The impact was devastating. He suffered a fractured skull, a broken pelvis, and multiple other injuries. Rescuers rushed to him and transported him to a hospital in Innsbruck. Surgeons worked urgently, trying to save his life, but the damage was too severe. The next day, during emergency surgery, his heart gave out. The man who had survived war, exile, and decades of life's challenges died not in battle, but on an Olympic training track. The shock rippled through the Olympic community. Luge was supposed to be celebrating its first appearance at the Games, yet before the competitions had even begun, it had already claimed a life. For the British team, the loss was deeply personal. They hadn't just lost a teammate, they had lost a pioneer, a man who had taken up the sport late in life and still fought his way to the Olympic stage. His wife and brother traveled to Innsbruck to bring him home. At their request, his body was returned to Poland, where he was laid to rest. A life that had crossed borders, wars, and generations came to a quiet end. Only days later, another athlete would die on the same Olympic slopes, casting an even darker shadow over the Games. When the opening ceremony finally took place on January 29th, the celebrations were tempered by grief. A minute of silence was observed in memory of both men, a reminder that behind the spectacle of the Olympics are real people, real families, and real risks.
The hopes of 12,000 athletes from 123 countries, a $650 million spectacle. It all stopped today in Munich. The Olympic Games in suspension, the spotlight taken instead by a gang of Arab fanatics and their Israeli hostage.
In the early hours of September 5, 1972, while most of the world slept, the Olympic Village in Munich was silent and still. The Summer Games had been running for more than a week, and the atmosphere was meant to be joyful, almost carefree. Organizers had even called them the Cheerful Games, determined to show a softer, more peaceful Germany to the world after the dark shadow of the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Security was intentionally light, guards were unarmed, and the Olympic Village felt more like a university campus than a high-security international event. Athletes walked freely between buildings. Doors were often left unlocked, and the world believed this would be an Olympics defined only by sport. But at around 4:30 in the morning, that illusion shattered. 8 armed men, members of the Palestinian militant group Black September, quietly approached the perimeter fence. Dressed in tracksuits and carrying sports bags, they looked just like athletes returning late from a night out. They climbed the fence without drawing attention, slipping into the Olympic Village under the cover of darkness. Inside their bags were not uniforms or equipment, but rifles, pistols, and grenades. Their target was the Israeli team quarters at 31 Connollystrasse. Using stolen keys, the attackers forced their way inside, but the moment they pushed open the door, they were met with resistance. Josef Gutfreund, a wrestling referee, realized instantly what was happening. In a desperate act of courage, he threw his body against the door, using his full weight to hold it shut. He knew he couldn't stop them forever, but even a few seconds could save lives. His struggle gave several teammates the chance to wake up and escape. Inside the apartment, chaos erupted. Moshe Weinberg, a wrestling coach, confronted the intruders and fought back, refusing to surrender without resistance. He was shot, but the attackers forced him at gunpoint to lead them through the building to find the rest of the Israeli athletes. Even wounded, Weinberg tried to mislead them, hoping to buy time or guide them toward stronger athletes who might fight back. But the gunmen already knew the layout. They had studied the building, memorized the rooms, and came prepared. As the terrorists gathered more hostages, another athlete made a desperate attempt to fight back. Josef Romano, injured and on crutches, lunged at one of the attackers in an attempt to seize a weapon. It was a final, brave act. He was shot and killed, and his body was left on the floor as a warning to the others. Within minutes, the peaceful Olympic Village had become a hostage scene. 2 Israelis lay dead, and 9 others, coaches, referees, and athletes, were bound and held at gunpoint. Outside, the sun began to rise over Munich, and the world slowly realized something was terribly wrong. News spread quickly. Television cameras gathered outside the building, broadcasting the standoff live across the globe. Nearly 1 billion people watched as negotiations began. The attackers demanded the release of more than 200 Palestinians held in Israeli prisons, along with the freedom of 2 German extremists. They also demanded a plane to take them to safety in the Middle East. Inside the apartment, the hostages waited in fear, unsure if they would ever see their families again. Outside, German authorities scrambled to form a rescue plan, but the situation grew more complicated by the minute. At one point, police prepared to storm the building, only to realize their positions were being broadcast live on television. The terrorists, watching the same coverage from inside, could see every move. Hours passed. Tension filled the air. The world held its breath. Finally, late that night, it appeared a deal had been reached. The terrorists would be given helicopters to take them and the hostages to a nearby airfield, where a plane would supposedly be waiting. Under floodlights and television cameras, the bound and blindfolded Israelis were led out of the building and onto buses. From there, they were taken to the helicopters that would carry them away from the Olympic Village.